It's my pleasure to introduce our next speaker, Kendall Tyree, Virginia, and she's with the Virginia Association of Soil and Water Conservation Districts. Pleased to have you join us, Kendall, today. Let me make sure your slides are up there on the screen. Are they up there?
Yep, I see them. It looks good.
Okay, very good. Take it away, Kendall.
Yeah, I've been at the end of a long list of great presenters before me, so I will try and move quickly, but hopefully cover enough that you get out of it some benefit also. You can move to the next slide. Like Minnesota, though, our program's not in place yet, but I will actually review some of the legislation that actually drove us to create our plan, and on that scale of 1 to 10, we were high on that list. That's kind of what drove the legislation. Now that the regulations, and I use that word loosely because it is a voluntary program, but regulation in terms of that's the process that our guidance for the plan has been developed. I think determining on how many people are going to run to sign up is in the air based on, is this too much of a burden for folks to get. So I'm going to run through the legislation, talk a little bit about that process and some of the components of the current proposed regulations, and then our next steps. Just as a little background, though, prior to the legislation that created our resource management plan, RMP as I'll probably be calling it, districts had piloted a program and currently are able to collect BMPs that are occurring voluntary with no state or federal financial assistance, so truly voluntary. And this voluntary pilot program was really seen as a piece of the RMP and took us to this step of developing that also. So in 2011, in our General Assembly session, House Bill 1830 passed that really provided for this type of certainty, that as long as a landowner or an operator fully implemented and maintained an RMP, they're deemed fully compliant with TMDL, the WIP, the Watershed Implementation Plan, we're in the Chesapeake Bay, and any other state water quality requirements. So I've just got an excerpt of the legislation up there. We can move to the next slide. So per the legislation, the Soil and Water Conservation Board, which is our governor-appointed board that has a director or a farmer from each of our 6 regions of soil and water districts, was really the one that was tasked with putting together the regulations for how this plan would develop. But that board, in consultation with our Department of Agriculture and our Department of Environmental Quality, were really tapped to be the ones to figure out how to actually put these in place. So the legislation actually stated that the regulations had to be technically achievable, as well as take into account the consideration of economic impact on the owner or operator. It also outlined the components that I'll talk about, the stakeholder group that was pulled together had to address for the regulations. Those things such as who was deemed qualified to develop a resource management plan, how would the plan approval process work, how long would the RMP be in place, what was its lifespan essentially, and how would we complete on-farm assessments. So on the next slide, the legislation, like I mentioned, said if you were fully implementing and maintaining this, you were deemed fully compliant. But in addition to that, it did say that you could not be precluded the enforcement of required permits, so poultry, for example, also, or other state applicable laws. It did also allow that the ag landowner and operator were eligible for matching grants through our state cost share program to really help you implement and maintain your RMP. So in Virginia, in recent years, we've had roughly a $20 million state cost share program that our districts implement. You are completely eligible to be working through the state cost share program to put down the necessary BMPs that would help you attain the nutrient management and soil loss requirements of the RMP. So in the next slide, there you go, the legislation actually did put some specifics into what your resource management plan had to look like for all cropland, hayland, and pasture land. And for cropland, you needed to have a nutrient management plan, a forest or grass buffer, soil conservation plan that achieves loss of T, as well as cover crops. And for hayland, it was those same first 3. And for pasture land, system limits, livestock exclusion, essentially, to perennial streams. I will say this was in legislation, it was in code, so even the stakeholder group that developed to really figure out how to make this work was a little, had some angst about the whole soil loss to T, and that was just not districts, but in RCS and all, of is that an overdue burden? Is that really going to be a stipulation to how achievable this really is in reality? But that's something our stakeholder group had to work with because it is in code at this point. On the next slide, I kind of outline quickly some of how our process and stakeholder group developed for it. So our Soil and Water Board initiated the regulatory action. They pulled together the 19-member stakeholder advisory group that brought a wealth of representatives to the table. It included our business industry, our ag, our environmental, the Association of Districts, as well as a number of our technical staffers. And the full committee formed 3 subcommittees to focus on plan development, compliance, and assessment. Assessment being really who does it and what does it look like. Plan development of who writes it, and again, what does it look like. And compliance and auditing process of what makes it certifiable and who does that. So the full group met 5 times between June 2011 and March 2012. And in March of last year, our Soil and Water Board approved the first draft of regulations for public comment. And that's, I say approved in terms of it really just moved the regulations from the stakeholder group to open forum, essentially. On the next slide, I was overly wordy in my PowerPoint for good reason, I hoped, knowing I might be last if we went alphabetical, but also you might want more information, and this could be posted on the NASCA website. So this link, this picture, as well as a number of links in my PowerPoint are linkable to our state agency website and other resources that you might find helpful in getting some information. In terms of wanting to tell you what our proposed regulations that still have to be approved are set to be approved possibly at our March 27th Soil and Water Board meeting, I kind of wanted to give you an idea of what it entails. So each soil and water conservation district in Virginia is going to have to establish a technical review committee to review the RMP, ensure it fully meets standards, and within 90 days of receiving that RMP, they'll have to let the owner-operator know if it fulfills requirements. If it fails to fulfill requirements, it needs to be returned, it can be resubmitted, with discrepancies really noted and fixed. If an RMP is located within multiple soil and water districts, and if you haven't noticed, districts really take on a big wealth of putting this on the ground and in place, then each technical review committee will review the portion of the plan that's within their district. However, the district with the most acreage takes on the burden of a lot of that responsibility for coordinating the review among multiple districts, or resolving disputes, corresponding with the owner, and when appropriate, submitting the documentation to our State Department to support an issuance of an RMP. If a district does not exist in that location, most likely very rare, we cover all but 1 county and a few cities, our State Department will actually be the one to conduct the review for the owner or operator. The last piece is the resource management plan. Implementation is valid for a period of 9 years. So they're given certainty for that 9-year period while they ensure that it's been implemented and fully maintained. On the next slide, at the expiration of the resource management plan, a new one can be prepared by a developer, but it must conform at that time with all existing TMDL implementation plans to include the Chesapeake Bay or any locally approved. So after 9 years, you're starting over in some sense and making sure you're being brought up to speed. It also requires the regulations periodic on-site inspections by the district, inspection being no less than once every 3 years, but not more than annually. And DCR actually has some oversight. Our Department of Conservation and Recreation has some oversight of our soil and water districts in terms that they would conduct a comprehensive review of districts to ensure that the RMP duties are being performed correctly at a minimum once every 5 years. I know I'm moving fast, but I hope you're getting something of benefit, and we'll have some questions possibly. Wanted to let you know who is actually qualified to do the resource management plan. So as to who can develop it, it's an individual who's qualified if they're certified as a conservation planner by NRCS, as well as a nutrient management planner by our State Department, or a nutrient management planner by the department, and you can demonstrate some type of academic and applied proficiencies, and the regulations go into some detail of how to go about that process. An RMP developer could be a district or an outside planner, but in terms of some of our concerns and in the reality right now, for the most part, it is only an RCS and district staff that are qualified to write these plans. And one of the big concerns from our districts is that the burden falls on districts to do the field work, compile the documentation, implement the BMPs, input data into our tracking program, write the plans, review them with their technical review committee, send information to our department, who then gets to decide whether or not they're approved for safe harbor. So the district concern is what happens if a private planner does get required training. Does that liability fall on the district? They're still going to have to review that plan with a fine-tooth comb to ensure that they're signing off on something that they still agree with. So there is a little angst among districts of why a district would ever want to risk approving a plan that they didn't necessarily write. And then last, our department actually will maintain an online registry of all RMP developers. On the next slide, when the Soil and Water Board approved those regulations to be moved from the stakeholder group to the public comment period, it then triggered an economic assessment impact statement to be done, which was completed at the most very basic level. And then there was one formal public hearing held during the 60-day comment period. Kind of wanted to highlight some of the comments. Sorry about the dark text in there. Those are links to take you to the actual website where we've got some of those documents online that you can read in greater length. The comment period really brought up some of the things we've been expressing in the stakeholder group also, which we served. There was some concern over the 9-year duration of the certificate. This 9 years represents 3 nutrient management plan cycles, but some of our folks on the stakeholder group wanted a 6-year certificate, while the ag and district community even saw that the 9-year being too short of a duration. And one of our district staffers really told me that, farmers have a lot of paperwork and government oversight, so why would they volunteer for a whole lot more? We didn't want this to be too much of an undue burden, but they needed to jump through some hurdles, of course, to get certainty. But further, having an RMP and safe harbor only exempts the farmer from following any new state laws for the lifespan of the document. We've been hearing some concern that once the lifespan ends, those laws have to be followed. The farmer will have to require practices, and maybe on a possibly tight timeline. There's not any real decision on how long they move forward through that. There was some concern over the frequency of on-site inspections. Some folks had wanted it to be done once a year. Right now it's being scheduled for once every 3. There was a lack of definition of perennial, yet it's used as a minimum standard in the regulations, as well as a need for a defined training program that needs to be developed. We haven't gotten that far yet either. And I think our biggest concern from a district perspective especially is that there's no additional support that's being proposed to assist districts in really putting this on the ground. Yet the state regulations actually have language in it that can withhold district funds if they fail to perform. So with a lack of resources, we're a little concerned of, will we be able to meet need and demand, and will the regulations that have been developed be enough for farmers to want to jump through that hoop? So the next slide you just saw, quick glance, really was just our regulatory town hall website. When you get the copy of the presentation, you can click through this to see the actual regulations and read them in full length if you want. Next slide, I really just wanted to highlight some of our next steps. After close of the 60-day public comment period, which happened this past fall, the department really reviews the comments. The board, in their March meeting, can adopt a final regulation with or without changes. And we're still waiting on whether or not those regulations will change any based on the public comment period that we had. So like I said, the board's to review and approve them in March. Regulations become effective essentially 15 days after publication or the date set by the board, so we're still a little bit in limbo. And while, yes, EPA through the process definitely noted and sent information about how the program has great potential for providing substantial incentives to farmers to implement high priority water quality practices, that will definitely help our Commonwealth meet its commitments outlined in our watershed implementation plan, there's still a lot moving forward that we need to work out, especially noting the concerns of districts taking on a great wealth of the responsibility, but potentially having some of the lack of resources to do so. That was in a rush and a hurry, but Ray, if you have questions, I'll stay on.